C'è prima una sigla, qualcosa?
Sì, partirà una sigla di circa un minuto.
Ok.
In mezzo tra le telecamere, e do il 5, 4, 3, 2.
E poi io vado. Ok, benissimo. Perfetto.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte,
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo esiste anche grazie a te.
Buonasera a tutti e tutte e grazie di
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here in this session talking about education. We are thankful to the meeting that decided to host us once again with this session on this subject. We know that this subject warms our heart. It's highly debated publicly and by politicians. Sometimes it's considered topic of second importance, but we are truly grateful to the meeting for accepting to host sessions regarding this topic of education. Today's session is organized together with the 4 important associations in the world of education: the Association of Teachers Di.S.A.L, the CD Opere Educative, that groups together different private schools in our country, Di.S.A.L, Dirigenti Scuole Autonome Libere, which is one of the main unions of the school principals, and the Associazione Culturale Rischio Educativo. It's not by chance that this session has been organized together with these professional associations, because we are going to address this topic from 2 technical points of view. One is freedom of education and one is the school autonomy. Behind these technical topics, there is the throbbing heart of the aim of education, which is certainly the transmission of knowledge, but it also the communication of a profound sense of living, of learning, of growing, of becoming young men and young women that are responsible. As Pope Leo XIV said last 15th of May, education is mystery and mission to touch the heart of learners. To address these technical topics that are at the center of our agenda, important speakers have been invited, and we are thankful to all of them for being here. Yeah, this is a well-deserved preliminary round of applause. Ignasi Grau, General Director of OIDEL, that is an advocacy association. Then Marco Galdi, Professor of Public Law Institutions at the University of Salerno. Maurizio Serafin, who is member of the National Board of ADI, the Association of Teachers and School Principals in Italy. And we have Paolo Maino, President of Di.S.A.L, and Massimiliano Tonarini, President of CDO Opere Educative. Due to their role, we asked them to conclude with some suggestions and proposals and operational suggestions with respect to the topics that we are going to address. So before giving the floor to our guest speakers, I would like to introduce the 2 topics. The first one, as I mentioned, is the freedom of education. With this expression, we mean the possibility for all the families to choose the school that they deem the best for their children. When I say the best, I mean the school that most meet the expectations and the ideals of the very families. Families don't just want to choose the closest school in terms of space, but they also consider academic results. But there are other factors. And these are many. For example, the atmosphere of the school, the educational proposal, the ideals of the teachers and the school community, and the orientation towards certain topics and areas. This freedom of choice is an essential factor for the society with advanced school systems, and it's based on trust. Trust that the families want the good for their children, and they're able to evaluate the best schools for their children. In this country, in our country, this freedom is not guaranteed. We have to say that the first important law of 62/2000 that acknowledged the possibility of private schools to be considered equal to state schools didn't foresee adequate funding schemes to be able for the families to implement their freedom of choice. So there are now families that can choose to enroll their children in private schools, but these families are rich families that have enough financial resources to destine part of their income to paying for their school tuition fees. This is an injustice. Needy families without big financial resources are forced to choose from a limited group of schools, state schools, where there are certainly excellent schools, but it is this principle of limitations that should be removed. It is time to think about systems of funding that can give tokens to families or support to private schools, or a mixture of the two solutions, to be able for the families to enjoy the same rights in terms of educational choice and freedom. Claiming this freedom of choice refers to the fact that the schools are not all the same. This is a reality. Those involved in academic research in this field know very well that the curricula of schools, their efficacy and their organization, their activities differ profoundly. And it's not something that is known just by us researchers. It is also known by many families. Our school system is based on opposite assumptions. All the schools should be or are the same, but that's not the case, and it's not the case even in the varied world of state schools. Despite having the same rules of the game, there are huge differences from one school to another. In any case, we have the same rules, so school principals cannot choose their teachers, salaries cannot be differentiated, teachers cannot be evaluated, the school schedules cannot be changed, or the subjects. So there is an apparent, a cosmetic sameness, equality, but there are profound differences between the schools, and everybody seems to ignore that, and that's the other topic of today, that is school autonomy. Maybe the time has come to acknowledge the differences between the schools and let them emerge, giving space to all the schools to make their reference ideal explicit and their didactic and teaching and peculiar features more explicit. We think the time has come for this, to overcome an old model of uniformity of treatment that is not working. We consider that educational pluralism is a value, not a problem. Acknowledging this means promoting differentiation among schools. While guaranteeing a common framework which is essential for the country, this can enable schools to express their potential in a specific and punctual way. The first step in this direction is to give more autonomy and more power to school principals and to individual schools. The Good School Law made an attempt in this direction, but with limited results, we have to say. In our session today, we want to address these issues. We have limited time. We know that we cannot go deeper than a certain extent, but we have the occasion to address these topics. So we start with Ignasi Grau, and we ask this person to give us an overview of the state of the art. OIDEL, his association, calculates an index of educational liberty. The latest edition was obtained in 2023. We're interested in Italy, and we give him a big round of applause, and he will speak Italian even if he's not a native Italian speaker.
Prima lasciatemi fare un ringraziamento.
First of all, let me thank the organizers of this session, and it is an important topic also in my country, Spain. Please bear with my Italian. That sounds like the Italian spoken by a Spanish football player recently hired by an Italian football team. Well, today I would like to talk about freedom of education, which is something that is very dear to me. I think that this can be helpful to understand many of the issues that you address at a national level. I won't talk about OIDEL as such because that has already been mentioned. I would like to mention a couple of things. First of all, the right for education and the right for teaching. And in the second part, I would like to talk about the Freedom of Education Index to see what the situation is like in Italy with respect to other countries in the world and in Europe. So, first of all, the right to education and its constitutive elements. What is the right to education? This is an important question because maybe we talk about education without knowing what education is about. Maybe we also hear talking about freedom of teaching, but what is the freedom of teaching? Well, this is a human right first and foremost. And we should consider the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As you know, after the Second World War, the international community, with good intentions, met to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a document in which the aim was to strengthen the dignity of human beings and to help in this respect. An important element in this respect was the right to education. However, during the debates, what was mentioned was that the Nazi regime had an educational system that was available to everyone and free. So the first thing that was decided was to consider this right, but in the right way. And the declaration added a couple of fundamental points. First of all, there was a spirit to be delivered to education. We see that in the second paragraph. Education must have as objective the full development of human personality and the strengthening of the respect for human rights. And often, education is intended as a social tool, but we don't have to forget that children have to learn humanity. Many elements of humanity are not shared by everybody. That was seen by those who drafted the declaration. And that's why the third paragraph was added. Here, what is mentioned is that the state should not be the last actor in making decisions in this field. And to avoid a monopoly of the state, a third paragraph was added. It is the prime right of parents to decide on the education of their children. But as you know, the declaration is not a binding document, a binding political legal document, even if it influenced many other documents. So what do the binding documents say? Article 13 on the Economic, Social and Cultural Right Pact, it recognizes the right to education with the same words, but it adds something. It is the right to people to create independent schools. Because if there is nobody that can create schools, that right for the parents would be useless. Then there is Article 18 of the International Pact of International Rights and Political Rights, also acknowledges this freedom that is linked to a key element, religion, freedom for religion, belief, and expression. And we see also this in Article 5 in the UNESCO Convention against the risk of discrimination. And these are important for the influence that they had in Italy. What do we see at European level? At the European level, we see this freedom that is recognized in two documents. First, the Protocol of the Convention for the Safeguarding of Human Rights, Article 2, and in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, 14.3. Here we have the respect of the state for the rights of the parents with wordings that are similar to the language that we see in the declaration. What the Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice said is also interesting about this. They say that the safeguarding of the possibility of pluralism in education is essential for preserving democratic society. Many times we talk about the importance of how to preserve democratic society. The court talk about educational pluralism as a pillar in this respect. And as regards funding, we talk about funding many times, but to be clear, I'm not referring, there is no direct reference in any of the binding international documents to this. However, when we talk about freedom, it is curious to talk about freedom when there is something that can be enjoyed just by people that have economic resources. And what does the state do to guarantee this freedom? There is a resolution of the European Parliament of June 2018. This resolution says it encourages to increase the inclusivity and guarantee the freedom for educational choices, to provide adequate financial support to all schools of all ranks and levels, both private and not-for-profit. I would like to conclude this part with a couple of important points. First, the freedom of teaching is a freedom that is acknowledged and protected in all international tools that have been signed by Italy, both at a global level and at a European level. And number two, even if there is no explicit reference to public funding for this freedom, it seems to be understandable that it is a privilege for those that can enjoy enough resources. Now, moving to the second part, I will talk about the Freedom of Education Index. The Freedom of Education Index is a research work carried out by OIDEL, started in 2012. In 2012, I was not there, I was still studying, so I can't talk about that edition, but I can talk about the evolution after 2012. I can tell you something about the methodology. So this research covers 157 countries that represent 98% of world population. To carry out this research, we have had the collaboration of researchers from many universities, and we've had the help from members of civil society. We used data from the World Bank and UNESCO. The indicators that we considered in this research are these. First of all, with the first indicator, we analyze if this freedom is acknowledged in the laws and in the constitution of a country. The second indicator, that for us is very important, verifies whether the choice of a school depends on the income of families, analyzing the percentage of the cost of school that are not supported by the state. And the third indicator is has a corrective function. We don't want to overrepresent countries with a lot of private systems and not school systems, state school systems. And the fourth item includes the enrollment rate of school. And this was developed with the University of Geneva, but I cannot talk about this because I would spend a lot of time to describe this part. So if you're interested, we can talk about that later. Let's move to the results that are the most interesting part. Do we now have a more or less educational pluralism in our educational system? This is the evolution by educational regions. With the same indicators, we can state that at a global level, freedom of education is now at a better position with respect to 2012 and 2018. The only region where there is not this trend is Oceania, but it's not such a big drop. There are clearly negative cases and regressions that we will see later. What is interesting here is that we see a positive evolution, not just at a world level, but in all the regions with the exception of Oceania. This is the situation in Europe. I would like to emphasize, first of all, the situation of Italy that can be improved. Despite this freedom is acknowledged legally in Italy, in general, the choice of the school is still very much influenced by the income of families. Only 2 countries have worse results than Italy, that is Cyprus and Greece. An important step to improve this position would be the development of schemes for families to choose alternatively schools, state schools through funding, through state funding. That would increase the number of students that would access non-state schools too. It is also worth highlighting positive examples like the Netherlands, where freedom of education is largely recognized and there is ample support to families' choices. So a plural system could be developed there with good results up until today. And this can also be referred to Belgium and Holland. The educational freedom is acknowledged in national laws, and this freedom is generally recognized. There are some exceptions: Macedonia, Eritrea, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea. The court mentioned that educational freedom is a pillar of democracy, and the champions against the freedom of education are also the champions of other indicators against democracy. This is to be underlined. It's important. How many countries do recognize this in their constitution? Constitutions are an interesting document. We will talk about that later because it highlights a consensus in a society. Among the analyzed countries, we observe 101 countries among which Italy, that recognizes freedom of education as fundamental part in education. In the European Union, there are 22 countries in which we can say that freedom of education is legally protected in the constitution, but there are 2 mentions that must be made: the Netherlands and Slovenia. These are 2 European countries in which the constitution underlines that the state must actively support, that is, fund the families that access to non-state education. Also in Germany was mentioned by the Constitutional Court, even if it is not written in the Constitution. In how many countries do the choices of parents do not depend on their income, on their family income? Perhaps this is a bit too small, but don't worry because I will go through it. Indicator 2 in our index focuses especially on public funding of a non-state school or private school. This is fundamental to guarantee that that freedom is accessible to families regardless of their income. What we see here is that 78% of countries fund more or less non-governmental schools. It is true that just 31% of the countries give support to private schools that can be considered considerable. And I'm talking about teacher salaries, 31%. Then we have 47%, among which Italy, 47% of the countries that finance non-governmental organizations. They give little funding. The funding is not well defined. And if there is a school that is funded, we can find it, for example, in African countries, but nobody knows that. 3 conclusions on this. First, From an international perspective, it is not unusual to give public funding to non-governmental schools. This can be seen in Europe, but can also be seen in other countries such as Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Chile, and Peru. Second, it is true that in general, where there's more public funding is in the countries with a strong economy, and Italy is among these countries. And third, at a global level, if we make a comparison between this and the Freedom of Education Index from 2012 2018, we have been growing. There's more countries today funding non-governmental schools with respect to 2012. So this is the situation of funding at a European level, and I'm just going to mention a couple of points. First of all, Italy didn't change anything after 2015, and second, Italy is far from the European average. It's important to observe this because often the lack of funding of a state school is something unusual, but in fact, the Netherlands, Ireland, Belgium, Finland, and even France and Spain give this funding, and these countries are not considered as elitist or something unusual. Do families today desire more or less educational pluralism? Maybe the fact is that this is not funded because there's no demand. Well, first of all, the decrease in the students of non-governmental school has not been significant in any of the regions. This is important because sometimes this is mentioned for private schools, but that's not the case. Not for the state school, not for the private school. But there are some countries where there has been an increase. India, 28%, Angola, 12%, Nigeria, 12%. In these countries, this has happened especially among the poor through institutions that are called low-fee private schools. The greatest decreases have been experienced in Bangladesh, Dominican Republic, and Italy. And we don't know about this because we have no data, but we should mention Nicaragua and Eritrea too, that are countries that had a lot of restrictions for private schools, and even these were closed by the state. At a European level, this is the evolution of enrollment in non-governmental schools in Europe. It should not be surprising that the countries with most students in non-state schools, non-governmental schools, we found those in which funding for these schools is larger. Ireland, the Netherlands, Belgium. This chart, I think, is particularly worrying for Italy for one simple reason. Since 2012, only 2 countries in Europe registered a decrease in the percentage of students enrolled in non-governmental school, Italy and Spain. We should think about that. And I will stop here. There's a couple of conclusions that come naturally, but I would like to conclude with a statement and a recommendation. So up until now, in the Parliament, if you debate this and you consider what I've said, I've done my job. So the freedom of education is a pillar. The freedom of teaching is a pillar for education. It is acknowledged by international treaties that has been ratified by Italy. And then, with respect to other Western democracies, Italy has a wide room of improvement to guarantee freedom of teaching, in particular for the funding of non-governmental schools. And number 3, we have my recommendation. Listening to this debate and preparing this presentation, I have realized that this is taking place in an economic and sociological framework, but the debate on the freedom of teaching and education should be carried out within the framework of human rights and not in a context of sociological debate. If we do believe that it is a right, a human right, then we should commit to helping poorer families, for giving them the possibility to enjoy this right. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille Ignasi, è sempre utile.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Ignasi. It's always very useful to frame the things we're talking about with, in a context of data and comparisons. Now, let us now leave the floor to Professor Marco Galdi. I'd like to ask you to help us delve a bit deeper on the topic of educational choice. In one of your recent articles, you write the following: to effectively face the educational emergency, it is indispensable to rethink the public school, and at the same time, to fully guarantee the freedom of education, because this is consistent with the Constitution, as is consistent with the Constitution to value all those institutions that help the public school to redefine its educational pathway and complete the complex of equaling public and private schools, enabling low-income families to choose both the non-governmental schools and the public and the state schools. So please help us understand a bit more what the Constitution says, and especially the constitutional reference elements where this discussion takes place, also in view of possible future actions that can help us make more choices more in line with the freedom of education. Thank you very much. Thanks for this kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here because as a young person, I was a visitor of the Rimini meeting, so coming back here as a speaker is particularly emotional for me. The Italian Constitution deals a lot with school. There are a number of articles that specifically deal with the school system, specifically Article 33, 34, 38, paragraph 317, paragraph 6. In particular, our Constitution is a living entity. Each topic has to be contextualized in the general framework of our Constitution. So you cannot talk about school without taking into account the fundamental principles of the Constitution, so articles from 1 to 4, or Article 9, which is at the very foundation of the cultural foundation of our Constitution, as well as Article 118, paragraph 4, that explicitly forces the principle of horizontal subsidiarity. The approach of our Constitution is indeed complex, and the contribution given by our contribution to school is not of a secondary importance. So in 15 minutes, it is very, very complex to deal with all these issues. The topic of the school system, however, is at the very core, or has been at the very core of our scientific debates in recent years, in an attempt to, in a way, value the contribution given by the Constitution to the school. I'd like to read the words of an authoritarian colleague who says, and I quote, "It is necessary to, in a way, kind of remove the myth represented by the norms on the school. It can be painful, but there hasn't been any change of the constitutional model around the school, but basically there hasn't been any constitutional model revolving around the school. In other words, as a provocation, the school system has been, so to say, the Cinderella of our Constitution." End of quote. This is an opinion that is shared among many scholars who have, in a way, considered this topic and the related dialogue sterile, very confused, characterized by the focus on the role of the region and the role of non-governmental school. And this colleague, the colleague I was mentioning before, was citing before, concludes by saying that a project relaunched in the Italian school should be faced by shifting from our constitution towards constitutionalism. In other words, an ideology that gets developed, that can be developed from a process of self-understanding, considering not only the regulatory approach, but also the case law, as well as the social, political, and cultural context in which our constitution is implemented and enacted. Personally, I have always been quite, in a way, wary vis-à-vis ideologies. Several years ago, there was an exhibition set up here at the morning, and an artist from the former Yugoslav Republic entitled this exhibition, that was about ideology, as a project on man that does not consider the human nature that normally generates disasters. So thinking about setting aside our constitution and its principles to find in any ideology, for example, constitutionalism, the right way, the right path to relaunch our school is, in my view, quite worrying. And it seems to me that this choice is intentional in order not to approach the Catholic personalism that another doctrine considers the main inspiration of actually the constitutional content related to the school. So what does our constitution say about the school system? It first addresses the function that the school should have. If you read Articles 33 and 34, the word education stands out. But that's not the only one. In Article 38, paragraph 3, which is about the rights of the disabled, so using a language which is probably not that inclusive in current terms. Actually, the disabled, Article 38 talks about the right for these people to education and vocational training. So basically, that's a difference between education and instruction. To give an answer to this question, one should refer to a norm that does not exist. There was somebody who wanted to insert a first paragraph on the norms on the school, reading that, and I quote, "It is in the interest of the individual and the community to ensure an adequate education and instruction to any citizen for the development of their personality and for the fulfillment of their tasks." So these two constitutional scholars, Moro and Marchese, shared the opinion that the school had the task to educate, so to build the personality of individuals and to, in a way, instruct, so to, in a way, facilitate the possibility for these people to fulfill their tasks. These are very clearly clear-cut concepts. Education is the development of the personality. Instruction is the fulfillment of one's own tasks. And what tasks are we talking about? First of all, work. Tasks do not refer only to work and to, for example, to business, but rather those tasks relate to duties of solidarity that are referred to by Article 2, so democratic participation, also social commitment, are tasks and duties that the school should educate to. Not only work, as is often said, as is often argued in our country too. The Coordination Committee did not approve this agenda. There was an attempt to submit it again, but these concepts were not included in the Constitution. But if you systematically read our Constitution, and if you specifically read Article 2, which is a key article in our constitutional text, you can understand that the very strong idea based on education is there to stay. Article 2 actually states that the Italian Republic recognizes the rights of man as an individual and in the social forms in which his or her personalities are expressed. And that is indeed education. So the Constitution, our Constitution, shows this way. Social entities and the education of individuals in these social entities that one's personality is developed. So the idea is that of an educating community that has to be closely related to the family. In that case, the article is clear. Article 30 of our Constitution states that the parents have the right and the duty to maintain, educate, and instruct their children. So there's an additional step here. The relationship between the school and the family has to be stronger, as is the case today, compared to what it is today. However, the Constitution is not limited to its clarifying the aim of the school, but it also tells us the way through which this should take place. Metodo comes from the Greek, and it shows the way through which this can be done. And the street is, on the one hand, autonomy, and the freedom, on the other hand, the freedom of education, in the context of a pluralistic system in which you have a state school together coexisting with a free school. So our Constitution gives precise indications in this respect. If you start from the concept of autonomy, that was explicitly referred to in our Constitution in 2001. There was a norm, 117, paragraph 3, that basically distinguishes the responsibilities between the state and the regions, and that states that one should take into account the school economy within the context of a competition between the state and the regions. The very fact that autonomy was there to stay was doubtless irrespective of the explicit recognition by Article 117 in 2001. This idea of autonomy is already intrinsic in the content of Article 2. The delegated decree of the 1970s, especially 416 of 74, was approved well before 2001. We should wonder, however, whether we can be satisfied of this form of autonomy. I believe we shouldn't. I think we should have at least three basic reforms. First, we should recognize the fact that schools should have their own statutes, which clarify the educational project of each school. Also in the state schools, because also state schools have their own margin of autonomy in defining the curricula, 20% of the curricula, and this should be done with a very precise educational project. Then there are also organizational and teaching aspects that can be contemplated in the statutes of the schools, so that goes actually well beyond a mere executive statute. Then we should give families not only the role of proposing things. So families, especially when it comes to planning, and, for example, the impact of educational responsibility, families should not only submit proposals, but they should also have a say in defining these indications. And then there should be more flexibility in letting schools choose their teachers. From this point of view, I shouldn't entrust that to principals. The risk here is that they might play an excessive role compared to their function. I would like schools actually also to organize public competitions, as happens with universities, where you have the national habilitation and then individual universities organize a competition demanding for specific skills. So if you have a school that defines certain contents, still you have a selection based on the contents, which are basically decided upon thanks to the autonomy. The other fundamental aspect would be to complete the pathway of the freedom of education. Truth is, there is a norm in the Constitution, namely Article 34, paragraph 3, that states that non-governmental schools and state schools are on an equal level. The law stabilizes, sets the rights and duties of the schools, and the law has to ensure schools the same dignity and also the same treatment of the students of non-governmental schools, the same as state schools. This means so equivalent school treatment. This doesn't mean only that the title is the same. If we have equality, that means that the school have to entirely be the place of equality. If we have compulsory school as a free school, that has to be the same for everybody, also for those who choose a non-governmental school. If Legislative Decree 297 of 94 foresees that low-income families have to have a higher school that is free for everybody, that should be the case. Otherwise, we don't have full equality. I would also consider the possibility of actually filing an issue of constitutional legitimacy, because there's the violation of Article 34, paragraph 3, and also of the principles indicated in Article 3 of the Constitution. So everything I am saying is further reinforced by what happened in 2021, so by horizontal subsidiarity. That's a topic which is very dear to us all. So basically, recognizing school autonomy and the freedom of education are two issues that are closely related. Paradoxically, the more you recognize school autonomy, the less necessary it would be to have non-governmental schools, because through school autonomy they could, in a way, show what their needs are, what the needs of the family are in terms of education. So that's the way to go. School autonomy and freedom of education to make a virtuous differentiation of the educational offer, capable of ensuring effectiveness to the educational function and to instruction. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille. Grazie mille.
Thank you very much, Professor Galdi, for addressing both topics and for providing this different interpretation of the main articles of our Constitution. If I may, actually, I closed my contribution 8 seconds in advance. So the reference to without fees for the state refers to the setting up of the schools and not the ordinary, everyday, day-to-day business administration of the schools. So the Constitution doesn't set any limits to financing, but it rather talks about equivalent treatment. I'd like to ask Professor Serafin to talk about the point of view of ADI on the topic of school autonomy. Teachers are normally seen as the one who oppose autonomy, and yet the proposal put forward by ADI, in my view, goes in the direction of promoting more autonomy of the school. So ADI put forward a proposal. Please tell us a bit more about this proposal, how it was conceived and what its goal is. So good afternoon. Thank you very much to the organizers for giving ADI the possibility of talking about this proposal. I think this proposal is quite fascinating. Allow me to start by explaining what ADI is. This proposal stems from the experience of ADI and its nature. ADI is an association of principals and teachers. It was set up in 1998, so before the autonomy. This association is in charge of doing education, and it organizes a yearly congress that takes place in Bologna. And international scholars are normally invited to participate in this congress. We are open to the topics related to education and to scholars from all over the world. And thanks to this, we have conceived a proposal, a series of proposals that was then summarized in this formulation of schools with special autonomy. This proposal has drawn inspiration from the experience of other countries. So attempts made worldwide to resort to autonomy, especially the example of the academies in England that experimented this special form of autonomy in schools working in difficult contexts. Starting from this context, a particular form of autonomy was supported. And thanks to this experience, we have conceived and drafted this proposal. We were supported by Carlo Marzuoli and by the president of ADI, Siniscalco and Cenerini. They couldn't be here today to present the proposal in person. What are these institutes, these schools for special autonomy? We're talking in this case about schools who can decide to have their own statute and they can basically resort to all the forms prescribed by the law when it comes to autonomy. So they have the ability of putting forward projects, so they can rely on national curricula, but they can innovate them. They can even reduce national curricula. They also have the possibility of making firm decisions, determinate decisions, because the idea is that they have a governing body that is very similar to boards of directors. This governing body sees the participation of teachers and families, so parents, but it also sees the participation of territorial bodies. And there is also a strong innovation in terms of governance, so the community governance and also the internal functioning systems of the school are innovated. The teaching innovation is targeted to methodological innovation. So basically these schools can have an organization foresees the possibility of directly identifying teachers. They can have a school schedule which is quite flexible. And also the working schedule of teachers is broader. It is a working schedule of 30 hours per week. And these 30 hours per week can also contemplate functions and roles which are other than those of teaching, of teachers. So there can be staff destined to middle management. So teachers can serve as a support staff to the needs of the school. This organization meets the needs set. The exams are national exams, and the assessment systems are the same as with any other schools. From a financial point of view, these types of schools have their own budget, and the budget is basically determined by standard costs. Plus there is an integration, so there's additional resources in view of the fact that that special school has been explicitly set up to deal with particular issues and problems. The most complex part refers to staff management. This is quite new and also brave, also considering the examples that have characterized autonomy in our country. If you look for this proposal in the internet, it's a bill. So this means that it requires this text to be approved. However, the bill is quite technical, and it is valid, still valid today, even if it was drafted some years ago. Why is it still valid, and what's the meaning of talking about school autonomy 25 years from the first time when this draft was conceived? So what's the ultimate sense of this proposal after so long? This proposal of autonomy is, in my view, much more feasible now than it was 25 years ago. So probably the time elapsed between its first drafting and today has been used to experiment lots of solutions in the various contexts. In other words, there has been lots of actions and activities revolving around autonomy that have left several people a bit dissatisfied, because we've had administrative decentralization. However, throughout Italy, lots of experiments have been carried out in this respect, and many of these experiments have elements inducing us to say that an updated proposal today might be more successful. Because in the meantime, compared to 25 years ago, schools have de facto innovated their curricula. They modified their teaching organization as well as their methodological organization. At the same time, professional organizations of teachers have been set up. So the when it comes to teachers, there is a varied situation. At the same time, there has been lots of innovation from a technological standpoint. So we now have the right instruments to check and assess a series of data that now have to deal with the world of schools. And plus, we have a national evaluation system. So clearly, identifying these standards and proposing autonomous schools is now possible, because it is possible to now assess whether autonomy produces the expected results and if the expected outcomes are actually effectively achieved. 25 years after the first draft, although it seems obvious, we can say that if we are dealing with particularly effective schools, that means that we're dealing with schools who effectively use all the instruments revolving around autonomy. In other words, we're talking about schools that implement autonomy better than others. And this has been recently proven by a research study carried out by the Giovanni Agnelli Foundation, showing that in our country we do not only have territorial divides, but there are also divides in the schools and between the schools. So equality does have difficulties, and they're not to be attributed only to a different geography, but also to the different function of schools. It is now clear to everybody that schools can make the difference. That's why this proposal is still valid today, because we believe that autonomy can be the way for schools to actually make this difference. But what do we need in order for them to make the difference? Well, I think probably we should systematize and organize all the norms and all the regulations so that we can, in a way, identify trajectories and actually show schools in a very clear way what tools they have at their disposal to enact autonomy. On the other hand, we also need the support to autonomous schools to be reviewed. In other words, we should review the way in which our ministry can support these schools, autonomous schools, in the various areas. I think here lies the value of our proposal. And the aim of this proposal is to start a debate, again enabling our decision makers to actually use this proposal and actually integrate it in our pieces of legislation, in our legislative framework, so that this proposal can be significantly implemented. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille, Maurizio.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. I think that there is a great value in observing that a professional reality like ADI is putting forward a proposal to experiment with our school system with greater autonomy. Well, the way we wanted to conclude our session was to give the floor to the presidents of the two realities that promoted this session, just to end with proposals based on what we have heard during the previous presentation. So Paolo, Maino, and Massimiliano Tonarini were invited to conclude our session with some reflections and with some operational proposals on how to promote autonomy in schools. Let's start with Paolo. Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to the speakers, because they have helped me personally to go even deeper into the core of the matter. Considering what has emerged, it is clear that we had a season that brought in a few months to regulate autonomy, to give autonomy to some schools and to treat equality in another. It was a really rich season between the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. It was a really good season for that. Maybe, as you mentioned before, perhaps there was not a fertile ground there to continue to follow up on that, and that was lost in all the red tape that transformed principals and, as a consequence, teachers in bureaucrats eventually, that had just to fill out online forms. We are surrounded by platforms, especially for school principal levels. But without feeling the need to call for a new season of reforms, I would like to introduce 4 proposals and 1 operational idea. This concern some norms that are already available and that can be emphasized. Law 107, the so-called Good School Law, gave the government the power to reform collegial bodies. That power was not maintained, but it is clear that in 2015 there was the need to renew those collegial bodies that had been established in the mid-70s. Today, 10 years later, the topic is even more critical, and we have a model that could be considered. The proposal by ADI is very interesting, but there is already a model of governance for technical high schools, so-called ITS, that have been sponsored by the current government and the ministry and minister. In that governance, community bodies, third sector professionals are involved. There is a certain attention to respond to the concrete needs of the context, because it is increasingly indispensable to have a constructive dialogue with the community to step out of self-referentiality. So the governance of these collegial bodies should be managed with the forms that are already available. Number 2, we should give educational continuity. The summertime is terrible for school principals because there is a big swinging of teachers getting in, getting out. Can this problem be solved? For the first time ever, the government issued a decree to stabilize support teachers, that is, non-accredited school teachers that didn't want a position can, if they had a positive evaluation and if they had a positive review of the family and a positive review of the school principal and within the inclusion working group in the school, and if this person wants to stay, can continue to work in the same school even if it has a short-term contract. Why shouldn't this be possible? this should be extended to teachers that are accredited today and that want a position, but they are waiting for being called from a list. They keep waiting and waiting to see when they are hired, whether the end of August or the beginning of September, end of September. This solution can be solved, and historical precarious positions can be solved, increasing educational continuity, which is so much needed to have autonomy, because their context with relationships that are established with trust, mutual trust, can be created between the school principals and teachers and students and parents. And then number 3, we should have to relaunch Article 80 of Law 107. It has been just superseded by contractual terms. Previous teachers under this law were assigned to schools with respect to their curriculum and the teaching offer of the school. So there was a dialogue between the school principal and the teacher in order to choose where to allocate a teacher at least for 3 years. This lasted just 1 year, 2015, 2016. I remember that because I was lucky enough to choose a music teacher that was excellent, but just one for that school year. And the final proposal for the government is very concrete. It's more of a wish. There is a text from 1994, 31 years ago. There was autonomy, there was equality. There are thousands of laws after that, but those working in state or non-governmental state schools, they have to jump from one norm to the other without having a clear reference point that is nice and simple. So a single text now is definitely necessary and should be considered to be offered to the whole system. The final operational system is linked to my experience over the last few years for Di.S.A.L, the Association of School Principals. It is important to take advantage of the possibility to work in a network defined by Paragraph 7 of the autonomy regulations to respond to the needs of students in the context, in the community. It is necessary not just to work in a network, but to conceive as a network, conceive a group as a network. That means that the students' needs can be better understood vertically, from infancy to high school level, and in the different types of school, and also to understand the educational needs of our teachers. A network work is essential because suggestions can emerge from that, and those can improve our dialogue between schools in the same community and also in other communities. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paolo.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Ignasi's words are more than enough to get a proposal looking at the data that he illustrated. I would like to give some figures about non-governmental school today in Italy. Italian students from kindergarten to high school are less than 80 million. Those attending non-governmental schools, according to the latest official data from 23-24 school year, are 790,000. That is more or less 10%, with a special attention in highlighting the fact that it is still a school for few people. 113,000 of these 740,000 attend non-governmental school for kids, for little school, that is 3 to 6 years old, and they must attend that kind of school because the offer of state schools is not enough to cover all the needs of the communities. Just in Lombardy, there are more than 100 municipalities that do not have any offer from the state or from local authorities for kindergarten. So the topic of freedom of education concerns 350,000 pupils, more or less. Pupils that attend primary school, state non-governmental school are 6%, more or less. In Spain, they are 30%. In France, 15%. In the Netherlands, they are 70%, in Belgium 50%, in Ireland they are 99%. By chance, the last three countries I mentioned are those countries that have the OCSE PISA testing results that is carried out to measure the knowledge of one's own language and maths at 15 years of age. Well, these three countries, especially for maths, are well above the OCSE, the OECD average, and Italy is way far from there. So where we have pluralism in school, schools work better and school results are better. That's clear from this evidence. And those attending the secondary high school are 4% in non-governmental schools, and those in second-level high school are 7%. 115,000 students attend Catholic non-governmental school. This is in terms of the ecclesiastic law managed by religious orders, and also those inspired and managed by lay people according to the inspiration, the Catholic inspiration. So unfortunately, even figures tell us that this is a school for the few only. And if we talk about funding, this is even more discouraging. In terms of funding of non-governmental schools, we have 750 million euros. The budget for the school in Italy is more than 52 billion euros. So Italy spent for non-governmental school students about 1.52% of the budget for a population that is worth 10% of that. Over the last 2 years, there has been some more attention, especially on a couple of points. That is kindergarten, where with the Draghi government, and then this government also intervened to increase funding for kindergarten. We have about 130 million for 2025. If the bill on the budget assessment is approved, there's for disability also we had more funding, and historically we used to have 500 million in 2011 and 500 million in 2025. 11 years have gone by. In 2011, just to have an idea, we had Inzaghi and Gattuso playing at the Milan, and so if we think about that, we understand that a lot of time has gone by. Over the last 15 years, the cost of contracts has increased by more than 22%, and inflation more than 24%. So the request that has already been sent by the Catholic world to the Ministry of Education and to the government is to review, at least to review this budget, at least to align it to accumulated inflation. Then we had the equalization of the funding for disability contribution for 2025, the 40 million that should be stabilized, and also the contributions that are included in the equalization in the budget for kindergarten, 45 million for 2025, that should be also defined for the next years. All this cannot be enough. We are way far from those 22 countries in Europe that at least contribute to the school of non-governmental schools, covering at least the cost of teaching staff. For example, Catholic school teachers are about 55,000. An internal estimate, but that's more than reasonable. The cost is about 1.6 billion euros in terms of cost. If we make an estimate, in all the non-governmental schools, we can suppose that 2.5 billion could be the general cost for teachers. So from the session here, we want to take the invitation and bring it as an Association of Catholic Schools to the attention of the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of the Economy and the Presidency of the Council, is that a dialogue can be started so that in a few years it be possible to have new forms such as family tokens or direct contributions to schools that clearly will have to limit their tuition fees in this case, but with the final aim in mind that it is to the benefit of the students attending non-governmental schools. And we hope that this can be done quickly. Over the last few years, there's been a decrease in the number of non-governmental schools, about 30%, and students decreased by 15%, more or less. That's really unacceptable because smaller schools must be managed in a way. And this is against the big effort that is daily made by all the non-state schools, the families sending their kids there. So we must have the support of our government. Thank you. I would like to thank all our speakers, especially those of you that participated in this session, because as you can see from this debate, the topic of educational autonomy and freedom is not a dead debate. It has not disappeared from the agenda of our country. It is a lively debate, and it is reassuring to see that there are realities that have proposals, that are aware of the numbers, they know the reality in our country, outside of our country, and that together can create a credible proposal to be sent to our politicians today and in the future. Once again, thank you very much for your participation, and we hope that from this session more opportunities can be generated to go deeper into this topic. Thank you. Please allow me to remind everybody that a contribution can be offered to the meeting. Every donation is a new brick to keep building together this event. You can do that in the Dona Ora, Donate Now stations in the Fair Trade Center. Thank you. With a red heart.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Qualcuno che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo esiste anche grazie a te.